Which WWE wrestler has the worst finisher right now? Before we get to that, let's start with number 10, Jey Uso's spear. The spear is a classic move that wrestlers have been using as a finisher for decades, and that's part of the problem with Jey Uso's version of it. The fact is that several wrestlers are currently using the spear. That wouldn't be so bad, but Jey's version is kinda lame. It just never looks like he performs it right. In fact, commentators have gotten confused.
And with a cross body.
Now, I like the idea of Jey's spear, how he jumps right before hitting his opponent. It's kind of like he's attacking his opponent with his shoulder rather than tackling them. However, the person taking the finisher usually just falls straight down. If the opponent got knocked back a bit, it would make Jey's spear feel stronger. At the very least, the spear is a tried and true finisher. This next move though, I don't know who thought this was finisher material, and that's number 9, LA Knight. BFT. I've heard people say this is a worse version of the Stone Cold Stunner or the RKO, and I tend to agree. The BFT, or blunt force trauma, sometimes feels like it's done a bit too slow, but the real problem is that it often doesn't look like the opponent's head actually hits the mat. It's a little better when the person getting hit flips forward and lands on their back, but that's still not enough to save this finisher. LA Knight uses the Burning Hammer as a signature move, and I don't know why he doesn't make that his finisher. But hey, it could be worse. At least it's not. Number 8, Bayley, Rose Plant. In 2022, I created a video of the worst finishers in WWE at that time. Bayley's Rose Plant was on there, and 3 years later, it's still here. Simply put, the finisher looks messy, the setup is awkward, and the impact is usually minimal. Occasionally the Rose Plant looks good, but that doesn't make it an effective finisher. The same thing can be said for number 7, Noam Dar, Elbow Galactico. I honestly didn't know Noam Dar was on the WWE roster in 2025. To be fair, the man was out of action with a year-long injury, but his finisher isn't helping him stand out either. Noam Dar's finishing move is one several wrestlers have used, and that's a lariat to the back of the head. I personally don't like this finisher, and Noam Dar's version, Elbow Galactico, is a good example why. It just doesn't look like it really connects. On top of that, it just seems lame, especially for a cruiserweight wrestler like Noam Dar. Making it even worse is that before he got injured, Dar was using an enziguri as his finisher. It wasn't a great finisher, but it was better compared to the Elbow Galactico. Now, I'm gonna cheat a bit with this next entry, but I think you'll understand. At number 6, I have Grayson Waller and Chelsea Green, the Unprettier. The Unprettier, or Kill Switch, is a finisher made famous by Christian. I think it's a solid finisher. However, it works because Christian hooks the opponent's arms and uses his back to help drive their head into the mat. So why do I have Grayson Waller and Chelsea Green's versions on this list? I'll explain. Ladies first. Chelsea Green's version of the Unprettier is similar to Christian's, only she jumps before hitting the move. Because of this, it makes it look like the opponent is intentionally forcing their head down. Chelsea Green's Unprettier just isn't convincing to me, and it's hard for me to suspend my disbelief. By contrast, Grayson Waller's version of the Unprettier sees him doing a somersault over his opponent's back. Because he has less control over his opponent, the impact of the finisher is diminished. Maybe this is why Grayson Waller doesn't win many matches. I'm gonna say a no-no word, but I think it's the best way to explain why I don't like Waller or Green's versions of the Unprettier. They look fake. It looks like the opponent is choosing to fall down whenever these two finishers are hit, and it's an ugly way to end a match. So I guess the Unprettier is a fitting name. But what could be worse than that? Well, feast your eyes on number 5, Stephanie Vaquer, SVB. Vaquer's run in WWE has been pretty solid, and she's a very talented wrestler. However, she needs a new finisher. Stephanie Vaquer's current move, the SVB, isn't awful, but doesn't that a lot of the time, it looks like Vaquer is just sitting her opponent's back on top of her knee. This would be an alright signature move, but a finisher should look much more devastating and impactful. The same thing can be said for number 4, Asuka, Empress Impact. You remember the rear view, Naomi's finisher, where she literally used her butt as a weapon? Well, Asuka's doing that too. In June 2025, the Empress of Tomorrow introduced a new finisher, the Empress Impact. WWE tries to say it's a hip attack, but they ain't fooling nobody. That's Asuka's booty hitting her opponent. It was just as lame as when Naomi did it, but I would argue that Asuka's is even worse. At least with Naomi, she had a bakery. Asuka, well, no comment. It's just a weak and kind of silly finisher, not fitting of someone as skilled as Asuka. But what could be worse than that? Well, wait until you see Number 3, Julius Creed, Sliding Lariat. JBL's finisher, the Clothesline from Hell, was just a clothesline, but at least it was intense. Julius Creed's finishing move is similar, except the wrestler taking it is sitting down. I mentioned how I didn't like the lariat as a finishing move, but when the opponent is already down on the mat, it makes it even less devastating. To make it even worse, Julius Creed has so many better moves in his arsenal, like moonsaults and shooting star presses, yet this is his finisher. The saddest part is we still have 2 more finishers, and they somehow only get worse. Alright, let's rip the band-aid off. Number 2, Jada Parker, Hypnotic. Alright, the name is kind of clever, I'll admit that. However, this finisher is not. In fact, it's actually kind of boring. The idea is that Jada Parker rams her hip into her opponent's head. In reality, it's more like Parker runs into her opponent and they get knocked down. It just looks underwhelming, especially given the size of Jada Parker. Oh, I get why it's called the Hypnotic, because you'd have to be hypnotized to think this is a good finisher. Now, before we get to the worst finisher, here are a few dishonorable mentions. Mention Eat Defeat. I actually like this finisher, but here's the problem. The person taking it doesn't sell it right. What makes Eat Defeat look devastating is when the opponent snaps backwards. When they don't do that, the finisher appears flat and lacks intensity. Look at Gail Kim's Eat Defeat as an example of this finisher done right. Brooks Jensen, Southern Lariat. This is just a clothesline. An intense clothesline, but just a clothesline. Liv Morgan, Oblivion. I like the unique setup with Liv bouncing off the middle rope, and having her name in the middle of the finisher is pretty clever. However, Oblivion always seems to lack impact. It's not awful, but it just needs a bit more. Ethan Page, Twisted Grin. It's not that it's a bad finisher, it's just someone else's. The Twisted Grin is the twist of fate. I know that Jeff and Matt Hardy have given their blessing for Ethan Page to use it, and that's a good thing, but it's not helping Page build his own identity. I know that R-Truth uses John Cena's attitude adjustment, but Truth is more of a comedy wrestler, and also fits with the joke of Cena being R-Truth's childhood hero. Kelly Armstrong, Cali Connection. It's a cool move and a cool name, but it just doesn't seem like a finisher to me. This would make for a great signature move, like John Cena's shoulder tackles, but as a finisher, there's a disconnect. Alright, now it's time for the worst finisher in WWE right now. Number 1 is Dante Chen, Gentle Touch. As I mentioned, in 2022, I made a video sharing who on the WWE roster at the time had the worst finishers. There were a lot of bad ones, but the worst was Dante Chen's. For those who don't know, Dante Chen is the first Singapore-born WWE wrestler. He made his debut in 2021 and has spent the past few years mainly competing on WWE's smaller shows, like Evolve and NXT Level Up. Chen has a lot going for him, but his finishing move isn't one of them. It's called the Gentle Touch, and Chen just smacks his opponent's chest with both of his hands. That's it. And somehow, those chops are so powerful that the opponent is knocked out. I could understand if Chen was supposed to be a comedy wrestler, like how Santino Marella had the Cobra, but this is meant to be a serious finishing move. This isn't just one of the worst finishing moves right now, but one of the worst ever. With that said, who has the greatest WWE finisher of all time? Well, to find out, watch the video on screen.